Hi, fourth graders. This is our Wednesday reading. Cheweth by Sea. One day, two young men in old brown suits with red handkerchiefs tied around their necks strolled out of Boston. They kicked at stones, whistled, and tried to look innocent. But almost everyone they met recognized them for what they were: British spies. General Gage had ordered spies to scout the countryside toward Lexington and Concord. He thought the colonists had guns and ammunition hidden in that area, and he also suspected that two important leaders of the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were hiding nearby. It would be a great blow to the colonists' cause if he could capture them. Until they are sent home prisoners, General Gage wrote, I fear we shall have no peace. Finally, his plans were ready. Hoping to surprise the Americans, he gave the order to attack at night on April 18, 1775. But the Americans were ready for him. Two lanterns were hung in the steeple of Old North Church to warn that the redcoats were on the march. Paul Revere saw the signal, hurried to the Charles River, and was rowed across by a friend. When they reached the other side, Revere borrowed a horse, leaped into the saddle, and galloped off toward Concord to give the alarm. The regulars are out, he yelled and raced on. The regulars were the British troops. When men heard his shout, they dressed quickly and loaded their muskets. Meanwhile, the redcoats were hurrying down to the docks. Boats ferried them across the Charles. At the other side, there wasn't any dock. To reach land, the redcoats had to jump out of their boats into icy water and thick mud. The first men to wade ashore just stood there, freezing and miserable, until all the rest had arrived. Finally, soaked and muddy, the redcoats marched off, shivering down the dark road to Lexington. But as they marched, they heard an unwelcome sound. Church bells tolling. Drums were beating the alarm. General Gage's secret attack was a secret no more. So the British were hoping to attack the colonists in secret. But since the Americans had people ready to be listening, they were able to warn that the British were coming. To cross the Charles River, Paul Revere had to pass very close to the Somerset, a British man of war armed with 64 cannons. The least noise might give him away. At that last minute, he thought of wrapping the oars in cloth to muffle their sound. There was no time to waste, so he asked a lady for her petticoat. She threw it down to him from a window. In later years, Paul Revere would tell his grandchildren that when the petticoat fluttered into his hands, it was still warm. The townspeople of Concord buried their guns and ammunition in haystacks and freshly plowed fields so the British spies wouldn't see them. When they received warning of a British attack, they would dig them up, arm themselves, and be ready to fight. We're going to read one more chapter today called The Shot Heard Round the World. The redcoats marched all night, the distance of 16 miles, when they reached Lexington at dawn on April 19, 1775. They found a ragged line of Minutemen drawn up on the village green. Remember, Minutemen were the soldiers who were ready to fight at any minute's notice. Ye villains, ye rebels, disperse, lay down your arms, shouted Major John Pitcairn, a British officer. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Nobody knows which side fired it. This was the first shot of the Revolutionary War. It is known as the shot heard round the world. Now all the redcoats raised their muskets and blazed away. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen were dead and 10 wounded. The rest ran for cover. The redcoats gave 3 cheers. Then they wheeled around and marched off to Concord, in the center of town. They chopped down the Liberty Pole and burned it. Smoke billowed into the air. Meanwhile, Minutemen had been gathering on a hill beyond a stream. When they saw the rising smoke, they thought the British were setting fire to the town. Jonathan Harrington was one of the Americans killed on the green at Lexington. He managed to crawl to the doorway of his house, where his wife and son were watching in horror before dying at their feet. They raced toward a bridge that crossed the stream. The redcoats fired a volley across the water and two Americans were killed. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" shouted the Americans' commander, Major John Buttrick. A volley rang out from the Americans. Seconds later, 3 redcoats were dead and 1 was dying. At least 10 more were wounded. The rest quickly retreated. The redcoats formed columns and began marching back to Lexington, but the Minutemen took a shortcut. They were waiting in ambush on both sides of the narrow road. Ambush means like a surprise attack. Muskets blazed from behind stone walls, barns, bushes, and houses. As the redcoats marched on, the Minutemen ran ahead, took up new positions, and fired again. The terrified redcoats began to run. They dashed into Lexington and flung themselves on the ground, gasping for breath. They were lucky. A British officer, Lord Percy, had just arrived with 1,000 fresh troops. These new arrivals held off the Minutemen while the exhausted soldiers rested. Then they began the long march back to Boston. It was a nightmare. All along the route, Minutemen shot at them from ambush. It was dark by the time they finally staggered into town and reached their barracks. Many British officers were wounded during the march back to Lexington. Their uniforms made them easy for the Minutemen to pick out. The commander of the British troops, Colonel Francis Smith, a very fast man, was wounded in the leg, but he didn't dare get on a horse because he would be an easy target in the saddle. He had to limp along with his men. During this first battle, it seems like the Americans struggled at the beginning and then the British struggled at the end. After this first battle, who do you think is in better shape to win the next battle? After the battle at Lexington and Concord, do you think the British are more ready for the next fight, or do you think the Americans? Come back tomorrow to read 2 more chapters. Bye.